Hi, welcome to a new video of game design for gamification designers. My name is Javier Velasquez and I will try to make some short videos around how to use game design to increase the tool set you have for your gamification design. So in this video, this should have been the first video of this series probably, it will be around the topic of gamification fallacy. The gamification fallacy is something that I have been studying around how we have, as gamification experts, brought the idea of what gamification is and how it came to be this way. So, what is the idea behind gamification? And this comes from 10 years ago when the idea of gamification was starting to build up. There was already a game-based learning, serious games. There were other disciplines around understanding how to bring the game world to the real world. But here, gamification was trying another approach. It was trying the approach of using only certain elements of the game design world to improve motivation and engagement on the real world. So what we're going to do here is try to understand how this came to be, how this idea came to be, and why it's a fallacy to think gamification in this way. Let's start by understanding that the basic idea around gamification was the use of certain elements like the PBLs, right? Like points, badges, and leaderboards. And I will use points, badges, and leaderboards not because they were the only tool used on the gamification toolbox, but because it's the easiest way to explain the fallacy. First, we have points, right? So let's understand that the game world uses points for a lot of stuff. We use them as currencies, we use them as ways to track skills. Any numeric parameter in the game world can be called a point. In terms of gamification, we have a more simplistic view of points, and this is something that must change, and I will work around that idea in another video. Points is a really interesting topic that we should understand better as game designers to make better gamification design. The other thing that we have here are badges. So let's say we have several medals, achievements, trophies, however you want to call them, that actually started in the game world when Xbox started using achievement in their games. Medals actually existed from before, of course, but it really started to have a lot of recognition when PlayStation and Xbox systems started using achievements, rewards, and also everything like the game centers and everything that gives these kind of rewards for achieving certain milestones in the games. Badges, of course, are an integral part of the game world experience right now and are really important in terms of gamification design for a lot of things. So this is another part of the game world that we're trying to bring to the real world according to gamification. And the other aspect is leaderboards. So here is how I will paint my leaderboard here in my little board. So a leaderboard is something that will keep track of a ranking, for example, like a position table or something like that. What we have here is the idea that the game world analyzed these systems, especially in the sense of how the freemium world brought these ideas to life to create engagement. That this is where gamification was born, actually. Understanding how Farmville and games like that, all the free games, used points, badges, and leaderboards to actually increase the duration of engagement of a user, and how the data showed that these systems actually improved user retention than not having those systems on a game. So if you understand that, if you understand how it was born, and why it's so ubiquitous on the game world to use these kind of systems, it's easier to understand why we're trying to implement them in the real world. And that oversees a lot of important aspects of game design. So the first thing about the gamification fallacy was that in terms of gamification, the idea was, okay, as an expert, I can start bringing all these systems here to the real world and use them to increase real world human motivation. That was the basis behind gamification. And gamification is often used as a way of talking about psychological processes more than talking about game design processes in many ways. And that's why I want to talk about how we can see this from the perspective of the game designer. So it was about how this would affect motivation in real world and how this would increase dopamine levels or everything that comes with these kind of rewarding systems. But the real deal here, what I want to show you is this, that this is actually false, because these elements actually pre-existed on the real world before we brought them to the game world. We didn't invent anything as game designers in terms of creating points, creating badges, or creating leaderboards. They pre-existed the game world. So let me show you how this existed before to understand how they came to be in the game world. So we understand that gamification is not bringing things from the game world to the real world, but maybe they came from the real world, passed through the game world, and came back to the real world again. So let's see this with a little bit more focus. So let's understand that these elements come from several technological advancements from the humankind. The first one was accounting. So accounting was the idea that I could have some goods to trade, right? And some tables to trade those goods in terms of how much of a good would represent another good. And in the early days, our early written records, they're not for poetry, they're for accounting. And that's something that a lot of people don't know. Actually, many of the first written records are accounting records that help people understand what people owed me for the things I traded with them. So if I, for example, gave you some grains and I gave a lot of people some grains, and those grains would be valued in different ways for different other products, I would have to have an accounting book of sorts that would allow me to know that when the other people had their own harvest and they would have to pay me back, how much they owed me in the future. So accounting was a big technological advance that allowed for all our economical ideas behind how to trade goods. And this created the need for creating stuff like points or rankings, because everything, this whole currency system created the idea of how we can understand how a coin works. It can be virtual or it can be real, but it comes from the same principles. Games didn't invent anything there. The economic principles behind points, for example, or rankings were there already. Any ranking is any order of things through a means of counting, right? So I need to be able to count stuff to create a leaderboard around that stuff. And for example, I could have a leaderboard of the people who owed me the most, so I could know who I would have to go first to collect what they owe me. And so leaderboards had a lot of purposes in the real world. So this is nothing that comes from the game world. And of course, there's accounting, and there's a second technology that's really important that shaped a lot of what the game world was about, and that was the military, of course. The military has all the main engines that the game world took in the beginnings to create a language, a proper language of the game design. The game world was about simulations. So the first thing we have here is that we invented games to simulate things that happened in the real world. Why? Let's understand how the military works in the context of PBLs. So we have points, and yes, we have points. We needed a way to count our military strength, and that would be how many of any particular soldier I had in my army, for example. So let me show you these cards. Everything come here. These cards come from obviously some real board games. So if you know which games they come from, please put them in the comments. That's part of the game. So here we have our military, and our military had all different strengths associated to each kind of army or each kind of soldier. So what we would have is, if you see in this game, for example, we have the strength of our armies measured in points, because we needed a way to compare the power of one army against another army. So it was not just about accounting and trading, it was also a way of comparing things like military strength. So points in that sense were really important to understand how our military worked. But we also had badges. Badges are a way of creating some kind of rankings, right? So if I have these three level 3 armies and these level 1 armies, these ones are better ranked and they have a badge here in this card. A badge can be a number, a badge can be anything that creates recognition, a status, and that can create the idea of differentiation, for example. These have their badges, and we can understand that these are better equipped than these ones just because they are better ranked. And of course, this ranking creates a sort of leaderboard. So in the military world, creating rankings for specific goals, like for example, surviving 3 battles, that would give you a sense of a status. And if you have seen, for example, Vikings, the series, you will see that many of the badges were actually tattoos, stuff like that. And that was really important for creating a status in our social construct. So all of these are really part of the way humans try to understand their position in the social world and in the economic world. And this began here in the real world. The game world tried to simulate what happened here in the real world, because stuff like, for example, the Olympics, when the Greeks started creating sports and sporting events, they were trying to simulate warlike conditions without the bloodshed. So we would throw javelins and count how far the javelins would go and give that prestige to the one throwing the javelin that went the furthest. We started bringing these points. We started bringing these badges. So we have medals and we have trophies, so the gold and the bronze and everything like that. And we created rankings because we needed to compare the abilities of our different players. These were ways of comparison. We needed to compare them to actually know who was the best in the game world. And this is the idea that first came into being in terms of how the game world started appropriating these real world scenarios through simulation. So now we have the simulation of an army here in these cards by understanding how points worked in the real life by creating other different things. If you see here, gamification is not bringing nothing from the game world to the real world, but just actually repurposing things that already exists in the real world. So we're not creating anything new. That's the fallacy. So let's bring this back together in this sense, because we're going to see what happens here in gamification, what actually creates gamification as gamification. And you could think of it as a lens. Let's try to think about how the game designer have a different lens of the world than the everyday person, right? So, because the thing is, the real world is a poorly designed game that doesn't work around the laws of game design. And this happens because as humans, we tend to incentivize the wrong things. We try to incentivize direct behaviors, for example. So if you give me something, I will give you something in exchange. And we try to keep rules simple. And in the real world, we patch everything a lot. So if something doesn't work, we create a patch, and that patch actually changes the structure of the design in the real world. And what we can bring as gamification designers to the real world is not the points, the badges, and the leaderboards. Of course, they can be brought because they already exist here. So I can bring some of these elements here and create game-like scenarios here. But for them to be game-like, they don't have to have these freemium kind of principles or axioms. I can do something better. I can do something better if I understand how game designers think around the relationship between the player and the system. So we have a player, we have our octopus man here, and this player will work around the system, and the system will change its behaviors, and the behaviors will change the system. It's a really systemic view. And when you have this systemic view, you understand that in the core principle around the lens of the game designer and what we can bring to the real world mainly comes from the idea of the game mechanic. That's why this video series started from there, because the game mechanic is what actually changes the structure of these elements and creates something novel with them. Because when game designers took all these elements from the real world, the game designer changed its logic. Think about this. Think about accounting. Think about accounting in the game world. In the real world, we have all the counting based on our economic principles of capitalism and everything you want, and I will not do a critic of capitalism or the sorts, but we know there are a lot of poorly designed economic principles created in our own world, and that create inequality and everything that's been talked about recently a lot. So what happens when you bring the economic principles to the game world? You bring another sense of accounting. The rules of the economic world in the game world are different from those that we use here, because these are not optimized for experience. These are optimized for other stuff. Here we want to know that we have an economic system where people will be motivated to actually acquire more stuff. So in the game world, if I get one coin, that coin will be enough for me in the next round to gather 2 more coins. And this will actually build to become 6 and 10 and 12 and so on and so forth. So what happens here is the game world optimizes our economic system so people will feel like the game is progressing. Play The Sims, where it's hard to lose the game in terms of the economic principle. But here, by the use of taxes and expenses and sinkholes in the economic system, it's actually really hard to become rich if you are poor by design. And that's what we can start seeing the difference between these two worlds. In the military sense, the military can give us a lot of things around how to manage conflict. And conflict in the real world is also poorly managed. Competition, it's poorly managed in the real world. While in the game world, we have a lot of stuff like game balancing, for example, to understand how to create just games that create competition, but that do not create social friction. And all of those elements is what a game designer can see and bring to the real world in terms of gamification. So the fallacy is that we're creating or we're bringing game elements to the real world. We are bringing a lens, we're bringing a discipline that can actually change the rules of the design of the real world. It's not a serious game in the sense that it's not a contained game, it's not a little game that I had here and I put here and you can play it and then forget about it and keep living in your real world. Gamification should be around changing the design principles of the real world structure, the underlying structure, and that should be our goal. That should be what gamification is about. So if you have an e-commerce, if you have a sales force, you should try to change the way you design your system, your motivation systems, in terms of how game designers do that kind of stuff, and not just bring components and game elements to the table. So I hope you like this explanation. I hope this helps you understand how to better define our discipline, gamification. If you have read me, you know I don't think gamification as a tool. I think of it as a discipline, a design discipline. So gamification is not a good discipline or a bad discipline, it's just a discipline, and the ability of the designer to bring these ideas here is what will be able to change the world for the better. If we just bring the basic ideas to the real world and we don't create really the scenario for creating good game-like systems in the real world, we are just creating more poor designs, and we cannot do that. So if you think something here is interesting, if you want me to talk about anything in my upcoming videos, just write me a comment. I would love to talk more about this. My next videos will be built around organic and artificial game mechanics, because that's something that can really help us understand how we can change the game world, the real world, through the lens of the game world. And I hope you like this. I have uploaded this into a YouTube playlist, and you can subscribe to know when I upload more videos. This is something I'm doing in my spare time while I'm here in isolation and in social distancing. So I will probably be uploading these videos with some consistency, I hope. Give me a thumbs up and I will be more motivated to continue playing this game. So let me know what you think, anything I can improve, and thank you, and let's see you on the next video.